Good day, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Manufacturing Think Tank with Cliff Waldman. I'm Cliff Waldman. I'm the host of this show, one of many on Manufacturing Talk Radio. Today's topic, productivity. It's one that have had a research history with in economics, and as somebody who studied manufacturing for much of my career, productivity is critical. Manufacturing has played an interesting, important, and never-changing role in productivity. But today we're very lucky. Today we're going to talk about McKinsey and Company's latest research on productivity, getting, as you might expect, quite a lot of attention out there. And we have the perfect guest. We have partnered him with McKinsey and Company. Charles Atkins has been with McKinsey for 14 years. He is a partner in a partner in a big hotspot in the Silicon Valley office of McKinsey, where he serves leading high-tech companies on strategy and growth. He is a leader in McKinsey's technology and growth, marketing and sales practices, where he develops and publishes McKinsey's perspective on go-to-market and customer experience issues. During his time at the company, Charles has also worked on issues at the intersection of technology, economics, and finance through the McKinsey Global Institute. He's published several papers, including Debt and Deleveraging, Lions on the Move, The New Power Brokers, among others, and has conducted numerous speaking engagements across business, policy, and public sector audiences. As I said, he's been with the company for 14 years. Prior to McKinsey, Charles worked in the hedge fund industry in quantitative trading strategies. He has an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a Bachelor of Business Science from the University in Cape Town. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cliff. Great to be here.
I'm going to do what I always do when we talk about a piece of research that my guest or guests do, is I simply want you to, I love the way what McKinsey has on their website, because you get to both read and hear the paper, and I did both. And it's amazing how you get different perspectives doing both. So what I'm going to ask you to do just in a few minutes for our audience is to summarize the recent paper. What do you want our manufacturing, C-suite, business, executive audience to know about what you and your colleagues found in researching this latest paper?
Yes, of course. Well, to start with, Cliff, we like to start with the observation that productivity is hugely important, because it's the way that societies get wealthier. It's the way that we generate more welfare across the full spectrum of firms and consumers. Because ultimately, as an economy, you have the choice of either working more or getting more out of each hour worked. And it's true that when we look at the long-term drivers of growth and prosperity, labor productivity, or the ability to generate more output per hour, is the way that we collectively get wealthier. And when you look back over history, our rate of productivity improvement has tended to fluctuate cyclically over many decades. But after a recent heyday between 1995 and 2005, where we experienced quite rapid productivity growth, I think what many people fail to realize is that we've actually seen quite a substantial slowdown in the United States. And in fact, compared to long-term historical rates of about 2.2% annually, since 2005, we've really improved only at 1.4% annually. And while those might seem like small differences, they really compound and add up to a great deal over time. In fact, what we estimate is that if we could return ourselves to the historical rate of 2.2% over the next 9 years, that would actually add $10 trillion to our cumulative economic output, which represents a substantial welfare boost to each household, representing about $15,000 per household in 2030, which is 3 to 5 times as much as was dispersed in the stimulus packages a few years ago, which was viewed as a lot at the time. So this topic really matters, and it's an area where we've seen a tremendous amount of academic research and interest over the last few years. But I don't think it's as broadly appreciated by many business leaders how much productivity matters, nor the extent to which we've seen a slowdown over the last few years, despite all of the really exciting improvements in technology and some of the recent advances in areas like AI, et cetera, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. So we undertook the paper, not only to really put a size against this, but start to understand, what are the patterns of productivity? What can we learn from the places where it's gone well? What are some of the challenges that we confront as we look out over the next decade, and what can we do about it? And what was fascinating is while the aggregate picture has shown a slowdown, when you look across the US and we analyzed it across 4 different lenses, you actually see a story of some doing quite well and a story of others that have fallen behind. You see this very clearly at the state level, which is not a lens that many people think about. The US is obviously a unified market, and you tend to think about there being a lot of reasons for convergence between performance in different parts of the country. But actually what you see is that a handful of states have really pulled ahead of others in terms of productivity, that they've started at a higher level of productivity and they've actually gotten much more productive. And in contrast, that there's actually a set of lagging states that have not only started below, but are falling further behind. And that's quite a difference from what we've seen historically, where states have tended to converge over time over the last 100 years or so. So the first sort of recognition that we have is that actually, this picture of productivity performance geographically is quite mixed. Secondly, when you look at it by sector, what you see is that there's a handful of sectors that have actually done extraordinarily well in terms of their productivity improvements over the last 15 years. Sectors like information and software, finance, these are the sectors that have really led. And in contrast, there's a set of sectors that have really fallen behind, that are the lagging sectors in primarily service industries like healthcare or construction, that are both less productive, but also not improving their productivity. The trouble is the sectors that are fastest growing at the top only account for about 15% of employment. So we have a challenge as the economy. If we want to transform the aggregate growth, how do we take these sectors that are representing most of employment? In fact, when you look at the 2 least productive kind of groups of sectors, they are together 2/3 of the economy. How do we take those and really drive a significant improvement in productivity performance? Because short of that, it's going to be hard for us to return to those historical growth rates. And then thirdly, when you look at actually within sectors, it's fascinating, but what you see is that actually there's extraordinary diversity of productivity there. And this difference between what we call the frontier firms and the lagging firms is quite profound. In manufacturing, which I know is of particular interest to this audience, we see that actually the top firms versus the 90th firms, the bottom firms as defined by the difference between the 10th and the 90th percentile, is really a 5x productivity difference there. And what's more is that gap has grown wider over time. And so this phenomenon of, not only are there differences across sectors, but within sectors, at least this productivity dispersion that's at least as large is quite striking. And the question is, how do you start to think about, what it's going to take some of those laggards and move them closer to the frontier firms, who, to be clear, are growing just as fast, if not faster, than the historical productivity growth rates. And then finally, bringing it all together, we looked at cities as well. And you mentioned sort of being in a hotspot of Silicon Valley. Well, it turns out that Silicon Valley is one of those hotspots of 8 kind of metropolitan areas that have both more productive and again have exceeded the average productivity of other cities in the US and really taken off. So, as we look across these four lenses, states, sectors, firms, and cities, what you see is that actually, the challenge that we face is not so much that we aren't seeing productivity growth anywhere, but we are seeing it in a few places, but not broad-based enough to really drive the aggregate performance to where we need to be. And what we then call out in our paper is that as we look forward, there's a set of challenges as we think about how do we return more of the economy to those former levels of productivity growth. We're going to have to confront, and those represent some looming headwinds. These include things like labor shortages, particularly among skilled labor. This includes the challenges that we face around technology adoption, where we see technology everywhere, but the benefits have not been broadly shared. We have a more challenging set of financial market conditions, which may challenge our ability to invest in the way that we could in the last 2 decades. Fourth, we need to manage an energy transition that's going to introduce a trade-off between how fast we move to a clean energy future and the affordability of doing so. And then lastly, we're operating within a very different global environment, one that will challenge us much more so in terms of the cooperative economic rules that have arguably benefited productivity over the last few decades. So, with those headwinds, we do see a substantial, imperative for both policymakers and business leaders to really think about productivity and think about what they in each of their positions can really do to start to unlock more of that growth within the economy. And we outline a number of potential areas that we think are ripe for examination, ranging from how to develop, address some of the workforce shortages and drive more skilled labor, how to really get more benefit from technology, and then how to think differently about the energy transition as well. So maybe I'll stop there, but as you can tell, we've tried to lay out at least a framing around the sets of issues that we think are really important to address on this this issue, which we think is among the most important for your listeners.
Well, one issue that always does come up in productivity discussions that I've been involved in, whether it's with economists or business executives or reading papers, is data quality, measurement issues. Become central to so many productivity analyses, productivity discussions. Now, we can have an entire show about that. But one thing I wanted to ask you with regards to data, since we are, we have to think about the post-pandemic world, is work from home. All of a sudden, the question of what constitutes an hour becomes a little more difficult than it used to be. Is the work from home phenomenon, assuming that it sticks around, it does look like it's going to, is that going to make it more challenging to measure productivity?
I think it will for the occupations are being affected. So it's important to recognize, and there's some great work that's been done by Robert Gordon and others out there, that when we look at the impact of work from home on productivity, you can really think about different groups of occupations that have disproportionately benefited, and some others that have either been unaffected or perhaps even slightly negatively affected by the pandemic restrictions. For the types of work that can be done well from home, and think of a lot of your classic knowledge worker categories in this case, including consulting, for example. What you tend to find is that the ability to work from home has been tremendously beneficial, at least in the short term, and we did see a significant productivity boost. Some of that we also saw was accompanied by actually an increase in the number of hours worked. At least there's a number of surveys that have documented this. But I think what you do raise is an important point, which is actually the measurement of the denominator in this case of what's the output relative to the denominator of the hours worked. I think is getting more challenging to measure, and I think that is one of the data challenges that we face in actually being able to correctly estimate and understand what the impact of the pandemic and in particular on remote work has been. And I think it's fair to point out that there's a number of economists that are working tremendously hard to actually correct for some of these errors. It's not to say that it will be perfect, but I think we have a good handle on the places where we expect the errors to show up and the potential biases that might lead to. I think the broader question is, do we believe that the productivity benefits from remote work are going to be sustainable and we'll see those endure irrespective of measurement error or not?
Some of the questions that I prepared for you today, including this next one, are partially generated from conversations I've had over a long period with people. And in talking about the productivity malaise, and it's been a while now. It's a post-financial crisis productivity malaise in the manufacturing sector. People often say to me, well, the answer is straightforward: technology. If a new machine, a new technology can do it faster or substitute for a person in doing it, that solves the productivity problem. But the research, the very good research, and certainly McKinsey has added tremendously to this, is saying that, well, technology implementation certainly matters. My impression is it's not the whole answer. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for getting us out of this productivity malaise. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think you put that very well, Cliff. I mean, what we see is that simply adding technology to existing businesses, existing processes tends to yield minimal, if any, benefits at all to productivity. To really capture the benefit requires companies to reconfigure how they operate, how they do work, at the level of the frontline processes, to take the benefits of that technology. And very often that means reconfiguring workflows. It means rethinking talent and some of the skill sets of the people involved, and thinking about how to deploy that technology in the most effective way. And all of that together takes managerial capabilities as well, because it's the leadership and the managers that are ultimately the ones that need to shepherd the organizations through this kind of change. And there's a great deal of research that's come out recently that really calls out what's being referred to as sort of a J curve of technology transition, which is as you see technology investments being made, initially you might see little of and even negative impacts on productivity as companies undertake this kind of reconfiguration. And if they do so successfully, ultimately they come out the other side and get a huge boost. But that can be a multi-year journey, and it's a journey that not every company traverses successfully. But I think you're coming back to your point. I think the days of looking at it as, well, I can add, just add technology into an existing business and expect significant productivity improvements on the other side, I think are really behind us. I think that there's a long literature now that really documents the need to actually be thinking about, how do I add technology with complementary investments in both my organizational capital and my talent to be able to get the benefits of this.
I want to stay with the technology theme just for a second, because I have to ask about artificial intelligence. I mean, you can't go through a 24-hour period without some hearing or participating in some discussion. So I'll ask a simple question. To the best of your judgment and the judgment of your research colleagues, what do you think artificial intelligence, for all that we're scared about it, what do you think it's going to do for productivity? Is it going to be helpful eventually in getting us to the product point in the productivity curve where we really want to be, where we really need to be?
Yeah, so this is a deep question and an uncertain question. I think the error bars on predictions here are probably quite large. I'm hopeful that actually it will lead to pretty significant productivity improvements, and it's probably going to be isolated first to a certain set of occupations or use cases that find themselves most benefited by some of the recent advances around foundational models, large language models, and such. I think that, of course, we'll go through the same sort of muddling through period that I just talked about on the J curve, which is, as we figure out how to really capture the benefits of that, I think it may take longer than we expect. But I do think that the benefits that AI and related technologies can bring will be real, and ultimately deliver some quite significant improvements within certain sectors of the economy.
One of the things in the productivity literature that kind of fascinates me is this even within the narrow industry segments, this wide dispersion where some individual companies are acing the productivity exam and others are failing the productivity exam. And we have what you refer to, your colleagues refer to, and the economic literature refers to as the frontier firms and the laggards. Now, at least to me, that suggests that management practice matters overall in productivity. And I know that it's been hard for economists to study management practice because up until a while ago, we haven't had much in the way of real data to do that. But I think that's getting better. So I'm going to ask you, has the economic literature done any significant study to help us understand how management matters to broader productivity outcomes?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating topic, and I think probably there's 2 points to make here. First of all, on the characteristics of the frontier versus the laggards, I think there's an interesting set of observations around what some of the characteristics of those frontier firms are, and we go into some of that in our paper, where you do tend to see that they are more effective at leveraging what we call intangibles, things like intellectual property ideas, as well as investments in things like brand or skills, to deliver productivity and get advantage in their particular companies. They are also disproportionately better at attracting skilled talent, and also tend to be more connected globally as part of global value chains. And so I think a lot of those characteristics gives us some hints in terms of this sort of modern production function that requires bringing technology skills together with an access to open markets to be able to really capture the benefits. But there's a missing component to that as well, which I think you call out around managerial capability. And I think that's the second point here, which is there's a body of literature that is quite recent in the economics literature that really looks at the quality of management and tries to understand how much does it drive performance. This is done by folks like Nicholas Bloom and others. And the finding has been, look, that management really matters, and it matters a great deal, not only in terms of understanding and predicting overall productivity performance, but anecdotally, what we can see is that management really matters in these times when companies need to change and they need to adapt and adopt these new technologies to get benefit. So I think while there's still a lot more to be studied around the issue, I think that we can be clear that managerial capabilities really do play quite a critical role in getting in driving productivity and in getting the benefits in particular of these new practices around technology and intangibles.
Partially due to the pandemic, although it started somewhat before the pandemic, we are seeing a welcome increase in the pace of business startups in the United States. For a while, that was lagging significantly, and business dynamism was a concern. A lot of new firms coming on. We know that a lot of them fail, a lot of them don't make it. But is the phenomenon of an increased pace of business startups, is that going to be a boost for productivity, at least eventually?
Yeah, we would hope so. I think one of the factors that has been striking in the literature, and we do call this out in our paper as well, is that when we look at some of the declines in productivity over the last 2 decades in the US, it's been accompanied by declining rates of new business formation. It's been accompanied as well by declining labor reallocation across firms. And those have together painted a picture around business dynamism. And the worry has been, is this decline in dynamism partly to account for why we're seeing declining productivity growth as well? And there's a school of thought that actually these things are quite closely linked, even if causally it's hard to make that linkage directly. So I think we can be optimistic that the entrance of a number of new business startups would ultimately help productivity growth in the long run. And certainly we view an economy where there is more net startup creation as being a sign of health rather than a sign of concern. And we think that will help in the long run. Exactly how much is hard to say, and I think it's an issue that needs to be continued to be studied. But certainly it's a positive sign coming out of the pandemic.
With I have a big table behind me. I'm going to seat all major federal and state policymakers now, and I'm going to give you a chance to say, if you had to recommend to all of them productivity policy program, what federal and state policymakers need to do to get us out of this unacceptable productivity malaise, what would you tell them to do?
So we as a rule don't opine on specific policy measures, Cliff, but I do think there are a few specific areas that are worth examining, and I think quite directly follow from the analysis that we've done. First of all, it's clear that the places that are growing more productive, are all have the unified characteristic of attracting a lot of skilled labor. And we have this issue across the US where we've just simply got some demand and supply mismatch. And so we need to figure out, how do we unlock some of that workforce of the future? And this could take many, many different forms. Number one, I think looking at reskilling programs, different avenues through which we can help our workforce build their skills in a way that meets people at different stages of their career journey, I think is quite critical. Secondly, I think as we look at things like skilled immigration, and we looked at things like non-compete laws that prevent people moving between jobs, I think we need to look at those and understand, how do we increase both the immigration into the US, but also the mobility of the labor within the US that could be constrained by things like non-compete clauses, the way that state benefits are set up, the way that housing costs, as an example, can impose barriers. And then lastly, when we look at kind of our labor force participation, we also have this challenge that has been at recent lows, and in contrast to many other countries, has been declining. And so there's a question of, well, are there also some areas that we could look at to better retain the skilled labor that we have? This can mean flexible work policies for, aging workers that are otherwise considering leaving the workforce. This can also mean options that improve the ability for parents to stay in the workforce through better childcare and other areas. So I'd say there's one macro theme, Cliff, around how do we help support the transition of our workforce to a more skilled workforce and the workforce that we need in the future. I think there's a second theme around intangibles and the role that they play in the economy. And I think that there's a whole set of policies that probably need to be looked at, recognizing the critical important role that intangible investment has, but also the impact it can have around things like intellectual property, competition rules, and so on within certain sectors. And then lastly, as a sort of federal level policy matter, continue to support some of the public R&D investment that's been so important over the years. That's probably not a short-term win, but over the long term, the data suggests that the social benefits of government investment in R&D are quite substantial. The third I would say is around the energy transition, and I think there's a lot that federal and state level policymakers can do to help companies deploy capital more effectively, support innovation, even ease regulations around some of the innovation in that sector in particular. And then the last is a somewhat controversial notion, but one of the striking factors in our work is it's very clear that there's a spatial dimension to where we're seeing productivity growth and where we're not. And this notion of what's been termed place-based policies has a controversial history in the literature, and there's many studies that have been mixed in terms of the evidence of their effectiveness, but there's at least case examples of places where it has been quite effective. And so, one of the areas that we would suggest is that, we need to explore and reopen some of that discussion around, how do we better address some of these places that are being left behind? And what are some of the policy levers that are proven to be effective, and what are some of the things that we can do to really open up opportunities in those areas? So those are kind of four big themes that I would maybe highlight here in terms of an agenda, at least from a federal and state policymaker perspective.
Well, thank you for that. Sometimes difficult situations give rise to behavioral positive outcomes. Now, I mean, American businesses, manufacturers included, are facing constraints on the labor force side. One thing we're starting to see an aging curve in the United States and many Western economies. And within the United States, even compared to other Western economies, our labor force participation rate is oddly low. It's been a constant head-scratching source of concern. So putting those two together, and we are, there's no question that we are for a long haul of dealing with difficult labor constraints. Is that giving, and will that give rise to productivity enhancing behavior just necessarily?
Yeah, we would hope to. I don't think we've got, I think early returns are mixed, but over time we would expect to see that as labor becomes more dear, we would see companies making trade-offs to try to augment that and adopt more both labor-saving technology, but also adapt their operations in a way that can be more labor economizing. And so we would expect to see some of that in terms of the behaviors in the economy. I suspect that it is quite sector dependent, and certain places have more elasticity, as economists like to say, in terms of their ability to shift in response to rising labor costs. But no doubt, I think where companies have the option, they're certainly looking hard at ways that they could start to be more economical in terms of how they deploy labor.
Final question for Charles Atkins. My audience would yell at me if I didn't ask you about supply chains. They've been a great source of concern in recent years. Hopefully things are really starting to clear up there. I don't know whether this is an obvious question or an interesting question, but I'll ask you anyway. Is there a clear relationship between supply chain functioning and productivity outcomes? You would think there is, but how would you articulate it?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a really interesting question, Cliff, and I don't think it's one where there's a great deal that's been studied at the macro level on it, but certainly at the micro level of individual firms, we can see that quite clearly, right? I think the the uncertainty and volatility that has been introduced over the last few years by supply chain disruptions has been a significant drag on productivity in firms that have had to, interrupt their regular planning and their regular operations to deal with that. So I think it is certainly a critical issue, and plays an important part. I think we see that more clearly at the micro level, versus what we can tease out from the data, across the economy as a whole. But I think you're right in the sense that, I don't think we need a study. I think we can all think of individual company examples where it has been quite harmful.
Charles Atkins, you gave us your time. You gave us your expertise. Thank you very much for joining me in the think tank today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Cliff.
To our audience, thank you for joining us. In the coming episodes, we will be looking at the energy transition. We will be looking at critical industries. We'll do an outlook episode, because I think it's time to say, where are things going for the economy and for manufacturing, generally speaking. We have a time of certainly heightened uncertainty. Until then, I look forward to see you next time in the think tank.